Good afternoon. I want to say welcome to you, and we are delighted to see you. And my name is Kevin Coomer. I work with faculty and grad students through University Christian Fellowship. And 25 plus years ago today, something was started by Jason Chen in the Geneva's campus ministry called Finding God at Iowa. If my memory is correct, it was in this room or in some shape of this room without the dividers for that. The late Dr. Jim Martins was our inaugural speaker for that. And that event invited faculty and staff to basically share a bit of their spiritual autobiography with people. And that went on for quite a few years and was delightful. It came to a close at a given point. And today is the inaugural Field and Faith Forum. I have to be careful because my mouth wants to say faith and field, but it's Field and Faith Forum. And it's similar to the Finding God at Iowa, but with a slight difference. Our focus really is on, in one sense, the connection between scholarship and spirituality, between faith and field. Cornell West wrote about the scholar being called to facilitate transit between the study and the streets, and we would like to see transit between the sanctuary, the study, and the streets. And so this Trinitarian interaction between what we study, how we live in the world, and what our faith has to do with it. We are again delighted. I am not going to introduce today's inaugural person because I'm going to first introduce Brett Erickson. Brett Erickson, as you all may know, is the great-great-grandson, positionally, of Jason Chen. So, and is the new Geneva campus ministry staff person here. And this man has ideas the way Jason did. And he doesn't yet have as many connections, but he probably will in time. And but he's got great speed. So when he thinks of something, the next thing I know, he's scheduled it. And so I'm glad of that because at my age, I think of something and it takes a while before I do anything about it. So let me turn it over to Brett and let him further introduce today's.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So it's a real privilege for me to be here just as a fan of what Geneva has already done, and get to just step into that work and that legacy for just the relationship with Kevin, but also with Fred and Fred's willingness to come here today and share about his expertise, obviously as a scientist, as a physicist, as a researcher, but also too where that intersects with faith. And so this is a question that might be fascinating to some here, but it also might maybe be absurd or preposterous perhaps on initial glance. And so that's a good thing. We want to press into that. And this being a forum also offers the opportunity to have a Q&A at the end. So Fred is going to present on this question, is science or religion? And then we're going to offer about 20 to 25 minutes, and depending upon what, Fred, your availability is, maybe continue to ask questions even longer than that. But this is just a time to consider, to listen, but also to be able to have some good discussion and dialogue. And I'm excited that we're going to continue to build upon this for next month in April. We have Derek Muller, who's actually here with us, who's a professor at the College of Law and also an elections expert. He's going to be presenting on the topic of faith in elections. And then in May 4th, we're going to have Dr. Boris Kaljan. And Kevin, did I get that right? Kevin was helping me pronounce it earlier.
The way I know how to spell Boris is pronounce his name is Jason. When Boris first came here, Jason Chen said, "You say it like cow, as in California, and gin, as in the drink." And when Boris heard this, you could see him cringe a little bit. But I have remembered kind of.
So yes, Boris Kaljan, there it is. Is going to be presenting on conscience and considerations in a pluralistic society in May. So those are going to be here at the IMU. I think we're going to try to expand our space to the Iowa Theater. But if you're interested in just receiving updates on that and information on any upcoming event, there are some postcards with QR codes to scan. You can jump on to our newsletter and get those updates. So, Fred, without further ado, could you answer the question, is science or religion?
All right, thanks. Thanks, Kevin or Brett. And yeah, it's great. I've been actually at Iowa for about 25 years, roughly. And yeah, so I remember the beginning of the first Geneva Finding God at Iowa series, and I was part of that. So, yeah, and I will be able to stay as long. So today is a pretty busy day. I have one of my graduate students is giving this comprehensive exam at 2, so I absolutely have to be somewhere else before 2. But other than that, I'm here. All right. And so there are many ways to come at this topic, and of course I want to keep it fairly brief. I will, here's my brief outline. I'll just tell a little bit about myself. And then, if you look carefully, these are not exactly the same, and then with yes and no. In the second case, it's capitalized. But the difficulty with this subject is that there are 2 definitions for science that are equivocated on in ordinary conversation, which I think just makes it difficult for people to discuss the subject. And so I'm going to try to untangle that, hopefully. We'll see how that goes. So I'll just talk briefly about myself. I was raised in a log cabin, actually, and in the woods, and my mother was a botanist. You see her with her garden there. And I spent a lot of my childhood working in those fields. And I wasn't raised to be a Christian. I was raised to be an atheist, actually. And it really wasn't until I went off to university, which happened to be an atheist university, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, founded by very famous Ezra Cornell and Andrew Dixon White, were pretty famous atheists. But it was there that I became skeptical of skepticism and ultimately came to faith. But I won't have time to talk about my testimony full here, but just so you know a little bit of my background, I, at Cornell, was a major in engineering physics, and then went on and did a PhD at Princeton in physics. And then I've been working in the area of ionized gases, and that's what brought me to Iowa, because Van Allen, studying space physics, that's all ionized gas out in space, and so he was very interested in my field. So my goal in this talk is, it was actually 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I had the privilege of being elected president of my division of the American Physical Society, so that's the National Association of Physicists in the United States. And so one of the goals, the principal goal of the APS, is to promote the understanding and appreciation for science, in physics in particular, and its strengths and limitations. And I think that's exactly my goal here today, is exactly in line with the goal that we have in the APS. And also just to promote understanding, I think that there's a perception that it's come out of some of the controversy in this, what's called the science wars, the ideological war about science, has divided people. And my goal is, through trying to understand this and untangle it a little bit, maybe people can understand each other better and get along better, and that's my hope. And then, so to build trust, but also so to discern. I mean, so that you can, when you hear something saying science says, that you'll be able to say, was that something somebody measured in the laboratory, or is that an ideology coming from somewhere else? And so, and there are people, I will admit, one thing that grieves me is when people are oppressed by an ideology that pretends to be science, but is actually a religion, materialism. And so here's a quote of Richard Dawkins. It's hard to resist that quote. But basically, that kind of thing, for me, when I think of the sensitive person sitting in the pew and they're being browbeaten down, it's oppression. And I want to help people understand what's going on in our culture, because actually I think materialism is really currently the state-instituted religion in the Western world. So first, though, I want to start by saying, is science religion? No. Every scientist that I know who actually does research, they are interested in learning about the world around them. And really, science is, if you want to call it describing the world around us or learning about the world around us, it's really a process of thinking and doing that belongs to all people. In fact, if you really want to see a really masterful scientist, I have a grandson who's just about 2. Just watch them. They're playing, they're thinking, and they're learning. They're learning complex processes like how to walk and how to talk and things like this. And they're all doing it by a process of trial and error and thinking about it and forming ideas about things. And so science belongs, first of all, you should know that science belongs to all of you. Whatever your worldview, whatever, you're a human being. And just like language belongs to all of you, science belongs to all of you. You don't have to have a white lab coat. It helps in understanding. I should have brought one. Anyway, but basically I would define it, and I'll give it a little bit more detail, which I actually use in my courses in lab, and also in even for non-majors to help them understand what science is. And so, from a scriptural point of view, really, I mean, it's assumed that we will look at the world around us and think about it and learn that way. That's an assumption. In fact, in everything that's written, it's assumed that you're able to relate it to things that you've seen and touched so that you can understand what they're saying. It's part of intelligibility in general. All right. So I'm going to give this picture is something that I've used again because when you're a scientist doing research, there's what we call an epistemological problem. How do you learn something that you don't know already? And how do you ask a question? Well, if the questions you're asking, usually with research, the problem is we're asking the wrong questions. So then how do you correct your questions so you're even asking the right question so you can get an answer, right? Because if you insist on asking the wrong question in research, you just bang your head against the wall. And so it's a very complex process, a very human process. And it has these, and I won't have time to go through, but I'm going to go through them briefly because I think it helps to understand the fact that science, the process itself, is not explained by science. In other words, science is a human process with all kinds of assumptions that we need to make to do it, and those assumptions aren't proven by science. We need to assume them so that we can actually do the research. Okay? And there are assumptions that people make so automatically that they don't realize they're making an assumption. But it's the job of a scientist to think about, carefully, what are we assuming here? And because often subtle things that we assume need modification, and that's how science progresses. But anyway, so it's basically, you can see here, I'm boldly asserting that there's something objectively real. I'm not saying that's all of reality is in there. I'm saying that science can capture some aspects. We believe there are real things that we can find out about them by an experiment. Okay? And that is just that's all you need to believe is that there's something that's going to be objectively real. And then we have this process where you play with it and experiment. And it's just being observant, right? But subtle assumptions here. How do we know what questions to ask, right? There's an interpretive element, a semantic element to this process, which is not something which science itself tells you. So people that's why people go to graduate school so they can learn how to do research, is because you see another human being doing it, you're like, oh, that's what you're doing. Analysis, and I'm just going to breeze through these. So that's taking, any kind of physical experiment, even just dropping a rock. There's a lot of stuff going on. What do I focus on, right? And so you have to say, well, let me just think about how long it takes for the thing I dropped to hit the ground, right? That's, okay, so then I can analyze, I'm taking apart what's happening and saying it has aspects that I can look at. But phenomena are complicated, and you always have a judgment about what am I going to focus on. And then in science, we invariably get to a place where we want to generalize. I mean, if I drop something and I say, well, I think I understand how this rock falls. I wonder if I drop some other thing. And if you watch a toddler, they'll do this. Toddler will drop it and it's like, I love that sound. And then they'll go over, find something else to drop, right? And so it's, and the question is, do the other things fall in the same way? And so that's leading you toward a conceptual idea. So, but seeing a pattern is really a semantic thing. In other words, just looking at something and saying, what's really important about this, Like what's really important when I drop this rock is not that it missed my toe and it could have hurt me. Well, that's important. But it is how long it took to fall, right? I mean, I could think about a lot of different things there. And then we try to represent these ideas, which are somewhat abstract. And here's the difficulty, and this happens in physics, and I'm sure it happens in every area where you're doing research. Sometimes we find, I don't think I have the words or the mathematics to describe what I'm looking at. And then one of the things I learned in graduate school is how do you invent the mathematics you need if you don't have in the bookshelf the mathematics that is what it's going to take. And so this is an important part. I'm just going to breeze through these, so there's a lot that could be said about these. And ultimately, this leads you to formulating a theory. And again, this is, what I'm saying here is in the context of physics. There's research in every area, and I personally am a fan of Aristotle, and there are many methods and many ways of, it's adapted to what you're thinking about, right? What you're researching. So obviously, this will be what I know best. It's physics, okay? And so it leads you to a theory. And this is, it's a combination of things you put together, you try to, and in physics we really, in some sense, desiccate all those experiments down to a really minimalized description and say, is this really what's, do we understand, can we derive from this an understanding of the way the world usually works, okay? Again, it's not saying that everything is described by this, but just some things, like drop. And then, once we have that theory, and we write down, something like F equals ma, or something like that, if you know Newton's theory, then we say, now I can calculate, if I throw something, how far it's going to go, right? And so, then you start calculating. And the reason you do that, so science is never, scientists are always have some goal, some teleology, in other words, some purpose to what they're researching. They want to understand something, and they want to use it, ultimately. But in order to use it, they're going to have to understand what are the consequences of this theory. And it takes faith to engage in research. This process I'm doing takes a long time. I remember from my grandfather, who was born in 1892, and he was the head of one of the Bell laboratories during the Second World War. And he said, and he was in charge of one of these laboratories, the whole overall laboratory. And he said, we had guys working on a thing called a transistor. And everybody's like, it's dirt. And that's because they couldn't get reproducible results. They're like, transistors will never be good for anything. Why are you wasting your time working on transistors? And, and they're like, it's interesting. It's really, it's going to be useful somehow. And so eventually they figured out that you had to control the purity of the materials, and then it's not dirt, it's actually a transistor. And so, anyway, but it takes faith to do that. They had to make arguments of like, let us continue this research. We don't know if it's ever going to be useful for anything. We just hope that the human, all our humanity will be blessed if we can figure this out. And who knows, we'll just know more than we did before. And now everybody takes for granted. Everybody's got a cell phone. They're like, oh yeah, right, of course. Everybody knew that. No, not really. Very smart people were not sure it was worthwhile. And so it leads to, but these applications happen. And then when you start building things, well, invariably, it doesn't always work the way you thought. And you realize, my theory's pretty good. In fact, when I designed the lab exercises for the physics major, I always make sure that there's something in there that doesn't fit the theory. Like the students go in there thinking, well, what you do is you kick the experiment until you get the theory answer you expected, and then you stop and say, I won. And but what I would do, as I say, if you make careful measurements, you realize the theory's pretty good, but it's not everything. And so, and then your job, if you want to really be a scientist, is to say, I wonder what's going on there. Why doesn't it work perfectly, right? And that leads to applications. And of course, here you also have what's called teleology, which means you do this research for a purpose. and you're trying to understand things. And so that, especially with applications, you want to make, a better toaster or whatever. But, there's another whole area, and I won't have time to talk about it, and maybe Loris, when he talks, because he's an ethicist, there's an ethical dimension to everything we do. And in science, there are ethical implications of how we treat our students. There are ethical implications of what kind of research we do. Everything's ethically, and where are we going to get that guidance from? Not from a mathematical equation, right? So where's it going to come from? All right, so they're open questions. Our theory doesn't work perfectly, and you go around and around, and you might think, hey, you're just going to go around and around and around, and that's where it does take faith, because sometimes when you're in the lab, you feel like, I think I'm going around and around and around. But the belief is that you will actually ultimately get closer and closer. You'll be able to refine your theory, and next time you'll be a little bit smarter, a little bit better, and you go back, and that's really how I think just human beings learn. You work on cars, you've been working on cars for 10 years, and then a day comes along, you see a problem like, hey, I never saw that before, and then you understand the car better, and you realize, oh, now I'm a little bit smarter. Next time I see it, couldn't help but mention that, Don. And it's just the way knowledge works in every field, I think. Okay. But there's another thing about this. I didn't say that we got to the end of it, and all these centuries, we haven't gotten to the end of it. And if you take now the best theories we have in physics, all right, so quantum field theory, and then Einstein's theory of gravity, and we can verify those theories through experiments to like 14 digits. You're like, wow, you really got this nailed. It agrees with what you measured at 14 digits. Problem is, we put those two theories together, and it says 1 equals 0. Uh-oh, something's wrong. And so now, if you're a cynic, you'd say, well, just throw all that work in the trash. Obviously, it's wrong. At least if you extrapolate it, it gets to a contradiction. And so this is something very delicate and profound about human knowledge. We know things, we can build things, we can do things. Do we understand everything perfectly? No. Do we have knowledge? Yes. It's what I would call human knowledge. It's sort of on a certain scale. But if we try to extrapolate and say, yeah, I've got a theory of everything, we get into trouble. And so there's humility. For me, when I was an undergraduate, and there was a gentleman there who I respected greatly, and he wasn't one of the materialists. But he was a Nobel Prize winner also. But anyway, he was in the physics colloquium, and everybody was trying to appear smart around him, of course, because he's a Nobel Prize winner. And the person was given the colloquium, and he raised his hand and said, excuse me, I'm sorry. I really don't understand anything here. And then suddenly everybody realized, oh, it's okay not to pretend to understand. And of course, he was asking a deep question. But the fact was, his humility, he was like, I don't know, was actually, because if you're an arrogant know-it-all, you're not very good at research. You already know everything, so you don't need to research anymore, right? But if you admit that you don't know, then you're able to research. So there's a certain attitude here that's open. So there are assumptions and limitations that come with these assumptions. When you assume something, it's going to shape your research. And so everyone has ideas about this, and this is what we call metaphysics, all right? And that's become, in the physics world, kind of a bad word. But the truth is, everybody does it. Everybody has ideas about what physics can do and what it can't do, right? And so we should just admit it, and then try to be open about what we're discussing. And I think that's part of this controversy, is just openly admitting, we can't get around the need to talk about metaphysics and what the nature even of human beings are, because we're the ones doing the research. And so I'm just going to give a brief list, but hopefully this list will give you an understanding of things which science needs to make progress, but which science has to just assume by faith. That's right, it's by faith. That this is there, and therefore the science is not a waste of time. So, first of all, this truth, whatever it is, that thing in the middle, it has to be firmly established in some sense. So, because science takes time to do. It takes a community of people, and you have to be able to repeat things. And so if, it doesn't need to be that nothing changes, but if everything's higgledy-piggledy, you'll never get anywhere, right? And so there would be no way to do science if there weren't a certain fixity in the way the world is. And so, secondly, if you can't break complicated ideas down into simple pieces, then no human being can understand it. You know, when I was a kid, when I was in elementary school, I taught myself how to repair TVs and radios. And the way I did it was, like, if you look at the whole thing, it's completely dazzling. But let me just look at each piece and understand each piece, take it apart. And if it's not possible to do that, then you're never going to get anywhere, because it's just going to overwhelm you. And so this is, and actually if you read Einstein's little book on relativity, he marvels at this. He's like, if the world weren't this way, our little puny minds wouldn't get anywhere. That's Einstein, right, saying that. So it's got to be in some way. But of course, you know, it's a subtle thing. Okay, and it must be possible to know something without having to know everything. Some people use a reductio ad absurdum, right? Which means unless you have an answer for everything, you have an answer for nothing. And that really is, I think, just not true to the human condition. And it has to be intelligible to the human mind. And this is something also which Einstein marveled at, that the way the world works is in some way, in some measure, seems to be intelligible to us. And that's surprising. It's amazing, and it's not something, you know, we could have, but obviously we have to assume it, otherwise we can't do science, right? And so you have to have some measure of control, or be in some sense able to repeat what you're doing. Again, a lot of this is specific to physics. But, you know, the truth must be there in some sense objectively, so that even when you're not looking, it's still there. And I'm aware of quantum mechanics. It's got to be true even when you're not looking. And now here's another one which I'm a big fan of Blaise Pascal, and so I recommend you read him sometime. But anyway, unfortunately, if people aren't willing to believe something, they won't. And so, all the science you want, and this can happen to anyone. So it's not just the other people who can do this, it's us. And I think the people, and I realize I'm going to be harping on materialists, but I think the materialists have a problem with this because they say it's impossible for them to have this problem. And whenever you say, I can't possibly have that problem, it seems to me you're dooming yourself to having that problem. And it must be possible to go back and improve. And so this existence of all these theories, you know, Newton had a particle theory of light. He thought light was little BBs. And then it transitioned into the wave theory of light. And then it transitioned into the quantum theory of light. And so it's going round and round, and each time, it's not like we said, oh, Newton was wrong. No, Newton quickly predicted quite a few things. And then when the wave theory was translated by quantum theory, it wasn't, oh no, the wave theory is wrong. No, it's not wrong, but it's not the answer for everything. And so, you know, you just keep going. It's amazing how crude theories, if you just say an atom is a proton, and then somebody built a spring and attached an electron on there, and it goes, ding, right? You'd think, well, that's a stupid model. It actually works extremely well. And you have to get into some very strange experiments before you can realize the atom isn't just a proton with an electron attached with a spring, right? And so, anyway, there were, in fact, in the early part of the 20th century, models which essentially consisted of all these springs, you know, attaching all these electrons. And then eventually they gave up on that, but those theories actually went a fair ways. They weren't completely ridiculous. And so, all of these assumptions are outside of the scope of science. All right? We have to assume them in order to get them. And if you can't do any science at all, you can't pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And so it leaves you in a delicate place. So I want to try to introduce a distinction because so much our civilization is so steeped in the last few hundred years in materialism that actually people don't even realize there's an important distinction which is lost on our civilization mostly. And so I want to make a distinction between what I would call elemental science and fundamental science. Now, in my field, nobody makes this distinction. You want to understand the fundamental nature of the world? It reduces everything to quarks. All right. But actually, that's an elemental description. In other words, it's breaking into little tiny pieces. And so if elemental science is the same thing as fundamental science, then, just list, here's my alphabet. There it is. I've explained the fundamentally all of language right there, right? I've reduced it to its building blocks of all language. And so now I'm the master of all language. See, I'm done. I got the fundamental explanation. And I could, put these in some kind of table. And now I don't want to make light of what's called the standard model. I mean, it's one of the greatest accomplishments of science. But it's not a fundamental explanation of the world. It's an elemental description of the world. All right, so let me pursue this idea a little further. I had the privilege of going into the British Museum at one point. So there's this thing called the Rosetta Stone. Now, say it's got all these little interesting features on it, and say you said, well, okay, let's hand this to the scientists. They'll figure it out for us. Well, what experiment on the rock is going to tell you what that hieroglyphics means? Well, there isn't one, right? So the nice thing about the Rosetta Stone is it has things written in hieroglyphics and in other languages that people knew. And so then people could decode it. Because hieroglyphics has little pictures like this, and you might think, oh, this is the word for canary. Well, no, it isn't. And so, you look at these, and they don't necessarily mean like what they look like. And so how are you going to ever know what it means? Well, the fact was, until they had the Rosetta Stone, they had a huge problem figuring it out. So let's take this further, because in physics, we reduce things. When you go through that process, we tend, I said, reduce to mathematics. And, the mathematics of a square is well known. But now you say, okay, it's got 4 equal sides, 4 equal angles. Okay. Is that the fundamental meaning of the square? Well, actually, the meaning of the square depends on context. It has a lot of meanings. And none of them, so you could say this is the fundamental meaning. No, this is the fundamental description. The elemental description of the square is that, its area is the square of the length times the width, and then you've got the perimeter is 4 times the side and that. All right. And mathematics, if it stops there, should we conclude that therefore it has no other meaning? That there's no more deeper meaning? So we look at the world around us. Is it, when we reduce it to atoms, is that the only thing that can determine its meaning? Is its function in an equation? No. I mean, the square, so I just found a few of these, and I won't have time to go through all this. But the square means exit. And if you see a square in Chinese and in Japanese, in Japanese it's the letter R, the rho. And in art, you'll see a square, it has a meaning, right? And so there's a symbolism there. And so you'd have to know that community of people, right, to understand, well, what does that square mean? Well, if you see this, it was that at the time they did the artwork, the person was still living at the time they did the artwork, but they were considered a saint, and therefore that's what that square means. And so you'd have to know that community. So, all right. So it's true, you need to be able to recognize the form. So the form is important in understanding the meaning, right? So understanding the basic nature of matter, you need to know its form. Yet, the meaning is not determined by science, only its form. And I'm trying to make a distinction. You'll see this distinction is not absolute. But I'm trying to make a distinction between form and meaning, okay? Which is often lost on our civilization. So, now the thing is, you could say, well, science is just, we just study forms, and then other people talk about meaning. Well, it doesn't work that way. I've never met a physicist or even a mathematician doing abstract math who said, yep, I'm going to go publish my meaningless equations. No, they would never say that. It always has meaning. Because it's a human activity. It's loaded with references to people and emotions, and so nobody communicates it. But that semantic interpretation, when people say, well, this is what my science means, they are bringing in something that was not determined by the science. They're bringing in their worldview. And so you should realize that scientists, like everybody else, because they're closest to their data, they're in a privileged position to talk about it. You should recognize that. But their interpretation does not necessarily depend only on the data. It depends on where they're coming from, right? Their worldview. And I think that's important. Now, the second part is science and religion. Yes, because, now notice I capitalize it here. There are people, and sometimes it's called scientism, okay? And this is just something that struck me. This is from 2002 in Scientific American, which is a journal which popularizes, science for the public. And so here he's saying, God appeared at Caltech. Well, he's saying Stephen Hawking. And, he delivered his lecture and sees scientism as a scientific worldview that encompasses natural explanations, all right, meaning materialist explanations for all phenomena. So everything is reduced to atoms in empty space, if you know classical materialism. But then all these supernatural stuff. Well, guess what? Some of that supernatural stuff is your own consciousness. If you want evidence of something supernatural, just be conscious. Okay? It's not reducible to atoms. And so you're already confronted with it. If you know anything, you knew something supernatural. It's your own consciousness. And so it's not paranormal speculation. I mean, he's using a kind of derogatory language. But basically, empiricism, a reasonable, everybody does that. Everybody looks at things and uses their mind. That's not only for materialists. So, but here he's saying that we should venerate and worship. And of course, you could say science is a religion because we have seminaries and which are the universities, and we have we have martyrs and heroes and all that. And so you could say, but that's not the point. The point is, and the materialists have and are entitled to their point of view, but it's only when it pretends to be just science. In other words, you all have opinions and I have facts. Okay? I mean, that's not really honest, because everybody is in the same boat when it comes to all those metaphysical assumptions that I described earlier. And so here, Richard Lewington, I really respect him because he's being brutally honest here in this New York Review of Books. He's saying, I'll just summarize it for you. It's basically, we take the side of what he's calling science there, by the way. It's not what people do in the lab, it's materialism. It's the ideology. So we take the side of science, meaning, so you see the word science, it could be one of these two definitions, and you got to know how to read it, right? And he's saying that, absurdity of some of its constructs. And why? Because, we have a prior commitment, philosophical commitment, to materialism, all right? Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That doesn't sound to me like something you learn in the laboratory. That sounds to me like a metaphysical assumption, right? And that's what it is, and that's really scientism. I would call it scientism, not the science. Or you at least need to somehow make a distinction between that definition of science and what people do in the lab. So materialism, what is it? Well, there's a long intellectual history here, and I don't have time to go through it. But basically, it's, and there are some people here, and I don't know, how am I doing on time? I don't mean I have much time.
We can go about 10 more minutes.
Okay. So there's a long history of materialism going back to the ancient Greeks, at least. And I think that the Philistines were materialists. So for the materialists, of course, science is defined in terms of, and you can't blame them for that. That's what if they're materialists, of course science is defined in terms of their materialist philosophy. The problem is, for the last few hundred years, that has been the definition that science popularizers use. In other words, it's an ideology that's being, and this, I'll talk about that intellectual history. In fact, I'll show you, give you some books that you might find interesting that will talk about this. So, in math, we have this, well, in physics really, we have this thing that if you want to compare two things, you have to use the same units, right? So we say you can't compare apples and oranges, right? What we mean by that in physics, if you say, well, which is longer, 1 second or 1 meter? You're like, well, they're two different things. You can't compare them, right? So when you say science versus faith, what are you doing? Well, when you're doing that, you're making science into a religion, right? And you got to admit that you're doing that. So I'll just go through some. So Democritus, is one of the early materialists, and nothing exists except atoms. So it's an ontology. That what really exists when you go out there is just atoms and an empty space, and we're all atoms in a box, rattling around, interacting in various ways. Here's a physics textbook, and notice the title, Physics, a Worldview. What does that mean? It's a religion. That's what it means. And that's what the author, I know the author, that's what he meant by it. Epicurus, another very famous materialist from ancient times. And he basically says you have to, you might be tempted to think that God's involved, but you have to train your brain to just blot that out. And that's what our civilization has done for us, is to think of everything in terms of reductionistic terms and just always assume that God can't possibly have anything to do with anything. And so really what was the guiding principle for Epicurus? He thought the idea of God was frightening. And I understand, actually, there's some truth to that. So he just figured, therefore, I'll just blot that out. And but that's not really, a scientist really, I think the spirit of a scientist is one who wants to really know, well, what's the way the world really is? What really is out there? And if God's part of it, it might be frightening, but better to know than to not know. I couldn't help but do a Google search preparing for this on the internet with my title, Is Science and Religion? And here's a gentleman with a PhD, and believe me, in my world, I hear this all the time. It's very painful for me. Because what he says is, look, first of all, he defines religions in a way that's very disingenuous. See, all religions are social systems. In other words, they're just constructs. That's what he means by it. And in order to even require something that is supernatural, like being conscious, and all designate something as holy or sacred. Like their sacred cow is God can't exist, because that wouldn't be scientific. So, but, here he's saying some things which actually are just historically incorrect. Religions are social out of necessity in order to reinforce their supernatural beliefs, which he says, which of course are utterly false. So he defines them to be nonsense. And he says, just to be thorough, significant scientific advances were made by lone scientists toiling in their labs out of their fields. And that was true of none of these. None of them worked in the vacuum. All of them were in a community of people who they were interacting with. So if you think that, scientists, even Einstein was out there, doing everything all himself. He certainly wasn't even in his lab. He was a theorist. But it was, so anyway, but this is the rhetoric, I would say, and it's, I'm sorry, I find it inflammatory. But the interesting thing about that is it's not about bravely facing reality. It's about refusing to believe in things that cause discomfort. And so the reason I'm so on edge about materialism is I would love to have a situation where everybody admits where they're coming from. Says, we all understand we've got to make assumptions. Let's put all our cards on the table. But if you're saying, like, all you people have opinions, and I just believe science, facts, it's not being honest, because everybody has to make assumptions to get anywhere in science. All right, so, and it's kind of curious because a lot of what was classical materialism up through the end of the 19th century was totally blown out of the water with 20th century physics. All those assumptions, like the eternality of the universe and everything which was believed up to that point, they realized, oh no, the universe seems to have had a beginning. And all these other things, all these assumptions are breaking down. And yet the materialist, it's morphed, in other words, over the last 100 years. The success of materialism, and it has to be admitted, is that the definition of science in terms of what does science mean is standard in the Western world. I mean, that's what, when people talk about science to non-scientists, because this non-scientist doesn't know what people do in their labs, if they just want to know what it means, they're using science as religion. And I would argue that it's the state religion. Because if you're a school teacher, you can be fired for saying that you came about by a process that was purposeful. So there's a court case that would set the precedent for that. So the weakness of materialism, and here I'm going to quote Stephen Weinberg, who himself is a very angry person, very hostile to theism. He's Jewish. He passed away a few years ago, but a very famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist. But his quote really is that he could, once you reduce all of the universe to atoms and empty space, it's meaningless. Once you've taken a piece of literature and then said, all I need to know is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and line up all the letters and I'm done, well then it's all meaningless. And it seems pointless. And it's heartbreaking. But this is where I think it leaves us. I have said some things about the intellectual history of materialism, and there's interesting that in the 19th century there was a group and they became very successful. Their goal, and this is a book by Ruth Barton, and she's just a historian of science, very good historian of science, and this is everyone, very few people even know about the club. But basically what happened was their goal was to throw the church out of the university. At that time, if you had something and you read the newspaper, they would say, you want to know what the priest thought about this, or the religious leaders thought about this. Nowadays, they'd laugh at you if you said, I want to print in my newspaper article what religious people, what the leaders of the church think about this idea. No, instead, they would go say, oh, is it scientific, right? So their project worked. They basically threw the church out of the universities and replaced it with what Herbert Spencer called the new religion, which is basically materialism. It was basically a revival of Epicurean materialism. And but this is very interesting. It's massive, but it's a very interesting read, and it's a very important part of our history, because then, when people say, do you believe in science? It's really asking you, are you an orthodox materialist? Other books that I think are very useful, which talk about so you say you pretend that no, all I do is I just use reason and measurements, and that's how I know everything. That does not lead to knowledge, and so philosophers have taken this apart. So Thomas Nagel is an atheist, but he basically realizes this conception of the world fails. And Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher, and he also does a really good job of taking this apart. And our own Marilyn Robinson, I think, is brilliant on this. And in her, this is a book of her essays called Absence of Mind. She completely takes apart materialism in a way that's just, she understands science better than most scientists, I think. So I will end with this. So I was on sabbatical. I spent a lot of time in French-speaking lands, and I was in France, and I found a book of Ampere's poems. I didn't know he wrote poems. Most of them were love poems to his wife, and a lot of his family were killed in the French Revolution by being guillotined. So he had a lot of pain and suffering in his life. But this is amazing. So this is my translation, which I had checked with a native French speaker who said, yeah, it's pretty good. So happy the one who in his learned watches, contemplating the marvels of this vast universe, before so much beauty, before so much grandeur, bows the knee and acknowledges the divine creator. I do not share the foolish incoherence of the scientist who would contest the existence of God, who would close his ears to what the heavens declare and refuse to see what shines before his eyes, to know God, to love him, to offer him a pure homage. That is true knowledge and the study of the book of Christ. So, all I can say to Ampere is amen. So I'm happy to take questions. not
Dr.
just
Skiff, I
cheering.
have a question.
Yeah.
So I was really intrigued, and I'm a teacher by trade, so
Yeah.
about the differentiation between fundamental and elemental.
Yeah.
And when some of the folks that you mentioned, one in particular who said, the more that the world becomes comprehensible, the more it's pointless. So if you believe that the elemental is fundamental, there does feel like a deep sadness, a despair, a heartbrokenness. And I'm wondering if the dialogue from scientists who believed that went on to talk about where then hope exists, or if within their religion of materialism they were able to find and define what hope is. I'm just curious, like if that, or if they just had to sort of acquiesce to the pain.
What's difficult is that if you don't admit that it is religion, then you can't really discuss it. So, but I think a lot of the materialists appropriate things like beauty, concepts that make sense in other people's worldviews, even though under total reductionism it just doesn't exist. I think I personally think that materialism is very problematic philosophically. It just seems to be so loaded with contradictions. It's hard to know what to do with it. The only thing is that the human beings who are materialists are human beings first. And so sometimes they'll say all kinds of very interesting and profound things because they're human beings. And so, I think there are people who certainly struggle with this idea of beauty. And, I know many theoretical physicists who feel that the best criterion for a theory is it beautiful? If it's beautiful, it's probably true. That's amazing, right? Why would that be, right? That's it, But I agree. Paul Dirac was famous for this, and the fact is, he introduced a theory, and everybody's like, "Well, yeah, but your theories can't be right." And he's like, "But it's beautiful." And then they realized, "Oh, there is such a thing as antimatter." Oh, your beautiful theory that was true, right? And so, initially, no one had ever thought there might be antimatter, And so, so he used the criterion of beauty. For him, that's really how he knew it was true. So, how does he know that, and how does he justify it? Well, I never heard in print or anything. Him justify what he meant. Why do you think you can get away with that? I think that the generation that I learned from in physics were much more God-fearing, and many of them, for example, went through the Second World War and thought, "Oh, we'll build a bomb and save the world." And then when the war ended, like, "Oh no, we didn't save the world. We created a huge problem. All these weapons that are so powerful, human beings shouldn't have them." And so it's that set people back, and they were more metaphysical. They were more like, "Oh my gosh," But I think that as time has gone on, materialism has encroached on the physics world, and so that now, it's sort of the state religion. So and I had a professor of religion tell me, "Oh, you can't be a Christian because you're, you can't be a scientist because you're a Christian. The two are mutually exclusive." And I thought, he said, "Oh, atheism is the foundation of science." And I'm like, "So you're telling me that intelligent design isn't science because it has a religious component? And now you're telling me atheism is a religious opinion. That is the foundation of science?" And that doesn't. But then I realized, okay, he's probably not completely insane. What he's doing is that word science is really materialism. And of course you can say you can't be a Christian and a materialist. But yeah, okay. Right? So that I can believe in. But when he said scientist, and that what he meant was, I don't deserve to be a professor. And he tried to assassinate me. So, yeah.
Question, Dr. Skiff. For students here, or just anybody here that might have trouble navigating that tension, maybe it's in the classroom, maybe it's with a friend or a relative, of just being able to respond to a scientism or materialist perspective that is very commanding, what would be your recommendation for how to either ask questions in response to somebody who's...
I think that first of all, it pervades our society so much that I think it's into our psyche that even people who don't believe in materialism end up, thinking along materialist lines. But I think the really important thing is you should realize that if you're a Christian, you'll realize that materialism isn't correct. And therefore, you're not talking to a materialist, you're talking to a human being. And so, and therefore, they have very interesting things you can learn. So you should treat them respectfully, ask them questions, try to make sure you understand them, right? Because understanding, right, is a complex process. And so you may think you understand them in a certain way, but my experience is people are much more complicated. And incidentally, I mean, in my career as a scientist, I have scientist friends who are in every religion that I've ever heard of. And, but because they're human beings, they can do science.
Yeah.
I think it's just something that belongs to all human beings. So respond to them as a human being is what I would say.
Yeah,
Love them and try to understand them.